So thanks everyone for joining us today for our webinar titled K-3 Reading Across the Grades and the Content Areas, the what, when, how much, and with whom. We're so excited today because our webinar is being presented by what I call the dynamic duo of literacy. We have Stacy Hurst and we have Donell Pons. And my name is Jeanette Beninati and I'm the marketing director at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. So as an educator, we're wondering if you find it nearly impossible to provide a solid reading foundation that works for all of your K-3 students. At Reading Horizons, we support educators with a robust, science-based curriculum to help students reach reading proficiency by the end of 3rd grade. If you're interested in learning more about Reading Horizons, our phonics-based curriculum, online software, and professional learning, please visit readinghorizons.com, or you can call us at 800-333-0054. Now I'd like to turn it over to Stacy and Donell to present K-3 Reading Across Grades and Content Areas. And now over to you, Stacy.
Great, thank you. And we're happy that you're here to join us today. We are really excited to be back on the edWeb platform. We had such a good time last time. If you joined us last time, on the next slide, you'll see the slide we actually started with in that last session as well. So we were talking about phonemic awareness last time. This time we're talking about those word learning strategies across the curriculum content areas. So I'd like you to just take a minute and think about, just as such a general topic, but think about what your understanding is. Maybe kind of activate that background knowledge. Are you a little cloudy on it? Do you have some good standing, but maybe a few clouds in your sky? Or is it crystal clear for you? We're hopeful that whatever the condition of your sky concerning word learning will improve by the end of our time together. I know Donell and I have been had a great time preparing for this and being reminded of really important things that we need to do to help our students learn how to read well. So welcome. The objectives from last time are listed on the next slide. And we talked about the role of phonological and phonemic awareness. We included this slide in this presentation because we know that the important thing that we covered there was that it can be applied in multiple content areas as well. So we'll be building on that and showing you more ways to do that. Our objectives for today will be to answer some of these questions. How do we remember words for reading, spelling, and meaning? Why is it important to teach multiple dimensions of a word? And how can we apply the word knowledge to content instruction? We're hopeful that we'll spend most of the time on that last question, so you have a lot of go-to strategies tomorrow, as soon as tomorrow, if you'd like. Donell, anything you'd like to add to to what I've said so far?
No, in fact, Stacy, you and I, as Stacy said, we were preparing for this and we had many conversations. It was fun to kind of distill a lot of the things that we do in our practice and pull out the things that we have found helpful and unique. But just today, Stacy, I was tutoring. That's what I do all day, every day. And one of my students is in his mid-50s. Stacy's well aware of this student. I've shared some experiences that we've had together. But while he should have been picking up a lot of these strategies in that K-3 space, he was struggling with just trying to put sounds down, trying to get the sound to the symbol. So he missed a lot of this, just the basics of how you approach a text. And we're reading a particular book together. And today he was reading, we did 5 pages. He was so into the text that here's this business guy. He's got all these calls that he puts on mute and he didn't even bother looking at his phone because he was so into this book. And that is exactly what you want your students to experience, particularly in those young early grades when you can have these moments. But we were using many of these strategies, so it's going to be fantastic.
Absolutely. I am really excited. And like Donell, we've seen these things in action. I'm a former 1st grade teacher, literacy coach, and my focus has been K-12. But I like to say now I've gone upstream. I'm teaching pre-service teachers, and we cover a lot of these topics. And I get to see them in application too. So really excited to spend the day with you, the hour with you talking about that. we did just want to start too with just a reminder of the changing emphasis of the components that we have in literacy instruction. We like this graphic from Michigan. It kind of outlines the components and where the emphasis should be according to the grade level. You'll notice in all cases, we need to attend to word learning, and that impacts everything. On each grade level, we're not teaching one of those components. We're addressing them all. And we know the important thing is that we are not teaching them in isolation, that we're making sure that we approach them in a combined way. So out of those components, topics, we have phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary. These are things that we're familiar with, thanks to the National Reading Panel, fluency and comprehension. Out of those, and thinking also if you're familiar with Scarborough's reading rope, the most important component influencing comprehension is actually vocabulary and background knowledge, once students have the ability to decode. So we're going to talk about how to build all of those really important things in your instruction. It wouldn't matter, we would be limited in our focus on vocabulary and comprehension if students couldn't access the text, kind of like the student that Donell was just telling us about. Listening comprehension might be right, in tune with where we need it to be, but reading comprehension needs to be boosted by those vocabulary skills. So on the next slide, we have some really powerful components of the research, things that we've gleaned from research about vocabulary. It's really important for all students. It counts for 50 to 60% of the variance in reading comprehension scores. And like I just mentioned, it's the most important single factor once students can decode. Thinking of the simple view of reading, if you're familiar with that, those are exactly, it kind of spans the two categories. We need to understand the words we're decoding and apply them to comprehension. It impacts verbal reasoning. In fact, if you've taken an IQ test, you've had a verbal reasoning score, and they use vocabulary to determine that because it's so consistent of a measure. It's central to language comprehension, whether you're speaking or listening or even reading or writing, right? Has a reciprocal impact on other aspects of learning, which is why we're talking about it today, especially in relation to other content areas besides reading instruction. So, and Donell, can you speak to this too? I'm sure you've worked with plenty of older students, English language learners, who have had a focus on speaking and listening. How do they combine all of that with the vocabulary instruction or vocabulary knowledge?
Yeah, you're so right, Stacy. It's interesting because I usually, as you say, work with older students, middle, high school, and adults. And it's really interesting when you start to get those decoding skills and words start to make sense in that sense. Meaning, applying and holding on to meaning with the word, you can just see it all coming together. So this reciprocal effect or compounding that you see happening when students can take a whole word, be able to analyze it on many different levels and have an understanding of it is so very important. And even connecting it, if it's an English language learning student, connecting it to words that might be similar cognates, and all of these things are so important to understand that we point them out, we teach them explicitly. And I'm so glad we're having these conversations about how we do this, right?
Yeah. And that changing emphasis too is important, like you're talking about, because initially the brain is mapping that speech to print with a lot of effort. But once that becomes automatic, then the brain is free to focus on the meaning of it. So it's important in our instruction that we're not leaving out any aspect, but we know when to emphasize which part of that continuum. So that's why some of these statistics become even that more powerful, right? And that reciprocal impact on other aspects of reading is really important because that means we can address all of those things together. And so you might have a classroom full of students on various levels. We all do. As a child development person, I know there are certain benchmarks children hit at certain stages, but in a classroom, it doesn't feel like they're all the same, right? Because they have very different reading levels and abilities. So it doesn't mean that you have to neglect a certain set of students to focus on the students who are learning to decode, and then turn to these students and build their comprehension. We can do a lot of this simultaneously. Small group differentiated instruction is still very critical, but no matter the setting, we can focus on all these. So let's talk about this. And you know what? I would say, Matilda, yes, in any language, these are really important factors to keep in mind. Now, in some languages, depending on the level of their orthography, that decoding piece is easier. It comes faster. Students in Finland don't begin reading instruction until first grade, and within a year, they're proficient because their language has a really solid phoneme to grapheme mapping. The sounds and the letters are very consistent. We know English is a little more complex than that. And then you have all the words that we have in English language. Now, we can't possibly learn all of them. And as teachers, we can't possibly teach all of them. We know that really helps reading proficiency if you understand the words you're reading. So there are two main ways that we know that vocabulary can be improved. It can be increased indirectly, and that's through read alouds, like dialogic reading, if you're familiar with that, and speaking, having conversations with our students. In fact, and Donell can speak to this more than I can, but our dyslexic students, we're often surprised by the fact that they can't decode because their verbal lexicon is so great, and we don't notice that there's an issue comprehending spoken language. The greatest way that you can increase your reading, your vocabulary, whether it's speaking or listening vocabulary, is actually reading. And that I thought was an interesting piece of information, because you can see how that gap would get wider and wider if you're struggling with reading and you don't read text. You don't read as much. So you're limited to speaking and listening, which is still, there's a lot of content available there. But if you also add reading to that, then you can build your vocabulary. Now, as teachers, we can help promote those contexts, right? We can do read alouds. We can allow time for our students to apply what we're teaching them by reading, and then we can have those rich conversations with them. But we can also teach explicitly to build vocabulary, which is what we want to focus on today. The question always comes up, how many words? What do I teach in a week? There's so many words. If you're talking about reading comprehension, then the standard is 3 to 5 words per passage or concept to really focus on explicitly. But remember, going back up to that initial, the way that vocabulary can be increased indirectly, if we're having our students read, they're going to build more than those 3 to 5 words. They're going to get those concepts and learn the words that are related. So that kind of instruction is beneficial for all students, even if they're already proficient readers and their vocabulary is already very large. So there are multiple ways to do that. Donell, what do you have to add?
Yeah, so I was just going to kind of toss in there that ear reading. So that's audiobooks for students who are struggling with actually being able to eye read, right? Reading it, looking at the page. That has value, because I've had this conversation so many times. There are teachers who want to push back and say it's not the same. They're not getting anything out of it. But for a student who is struggling, particularly in those early grades, to be able to have audiobooks and a rich variety of audiobooks that are supported. So my son, who has dyslexia, I have several children with dyslexia. My son had a particularly challenging case of dyslexia. To keep him interested and engaged, he had so many things that he could be a part of in terms of reading that he could not access yet with skills. We were tutoring, but he wasn't quite there. But we wanted to keep him engaged with reading in the stories. And so ear reading, audiobooks, that kept him well in level with his peers in terms of vocabulary and his understanding and comprehension. We would have conversations around the audiobooks. And so that's helpful too, to not just put a child with something to listen to without context. So he always had context for whatever it was he was listening to. But that's a really important aspect, and can be for folks who are, yes, developing skills to be able to read at a level that they could be at. In the meantime, they could be listening to audiobooks.
Yes, exactly. So that holds true even if your learners are in K-3. We don't want to forget that part of it, right? So we want to build their ability to decode and understand vocabulary through reading, but we also want to build it through speaking and listening, for sure. Let's talk about ways to analyze a word. There are a lot of ways we can analyze a word. And we'll talk briefly about why that's really important to know. But I can think of a word like teacher, and we can analyze it on the phoneme level. So I would say to my students, how many phonemes in teacher? T, e, ch, we have 4 phonemes. And then how do we map those to spelling, to print, right? So the T is represented with a T. The E sound in teacher is actually represented with the EA grapheme. We have the digraph CH, and then the R-controlled vowel ER. So orthographically, that's another way to look at the word. Syllabically, we have the word teacher, 2 syllables. And we would do that, of course, through speaking and listening. Students can hear that. And then we have the morphological component of any word. So we have 2 morphemes in the word teacher. The word teach, which means to instruct or to build on, and then the morpheme which is one who, right? So one who instructs or build on knowledge, we're assuming in this case. And then this is the other really interesting thing, whether you're working with an advanced reader or a beginning reader, etymology is something that I've always found helps students gain attention. It gets their attention because you learn some really fascinating things about words when you look up the history of a word. So the word teacher is Old English, and it comes from a word that meant to show or demonstrate, to point out, to warn, or to persuade. And I also learned, incidentally, as I was reminding myself of the etymology of that word, that the index finger used to be called the teacher. And that's a good visual for me because I think that's what we do as teachers, right? We point out, we show the way. And so, and we add to what they know cognitively. So that is a lot of different ways that we can analyze a word with our students. Why is that important? You'll see some research from Perfetti and Adolph. And this is just kind of a synopsis of that research. But the better a reader knows all aspects of a word's structure and meaning, the more quickly he or she can recognize that word in both speech and print. That in and of itself is a reason to analyze words on each of those levels, right? For students, just to make them really rich and robust. But most importantly, this kind of approach has a significant effect on automatic word recognition, reading fluency, comprehension, and writing, including spelling, right? That it helps writing fluency. So you can see it has a reciprocal impact. So why wouldn't we do this? And you can see even on the level of phonemic awareness, if we're talking about the phonemes in a word, then you're already addressing those students who are still on that level, who are still becoming familiar and developing that phonemic awareness. So you can hit all aspects of a learner. The next slide is a reminder of how our brain actually retains words, right? This is the 4-part processor. Donell, I'll let you explain this. You explain it so well.
Yeah, and Stacy, you and I have had many conversations about the 4-part processor, and I want folks to just be able to take a minute and look at it and think about what stands out to you most as you're looking at the 4-part processor. Maybe you've seen it 1,000 times. Maybe it's even in your classroom. Maybe this might be the first of a few times that you have seen the 4-part processor and how it is laid out. But just take a minute wherever you're at with it to look at what we're talking about as we travel up and we talk about the different aspects of the 4-part processor and how that might impact or influence your teaching to have an understanding of this. So looking at this is Seidenberg and McClellan from 1989. At the base there, we're talking about the phonological processor on the left-hand side. It's my left. That's the language input, language output, that sounds, that phonological processor, speech sound system. Notice the arrow that goes directly over to orthographic processor. That's the memory for letters, that reading input, writing output. So that's that sound to symbol relationship and teaching that. And as Stacy has already mentioned, some languages are more challenging, right? They have a more challenging orthography. So that all needs to be taken into account that right at this base, not all things are equal, depending on the language that you're learning, the challenges that you may be facing. Maybe it's a second language for you, and so you have a first language that influences how you are receiving this information for the second language. So just right there, think about that in just the base of what we're talking about with the 4-part processor. As we move up, again, watch those the arrows, as we move up and we get to the meaning processor. So we have our phonological processor, orthographic processor sharing information. As we get that down, we move to the meaning processor of vocabulary, making meaning out of what it is that we are seeing and putting together with a sound. And then that very top is the context processor. Concepts and information, sentence context, text structure, all of that additional information that is so important to get to the level of understanding, because that allows us to operate in any text at any level, right? And think about along that journey and the 4-part processor, anywhere where that could be interrupted for a student, where maybe there could be a challenge for a student. And think about in any given academic career of a student, that if that goes on for very long, if no one intervenes, if there isn't an opportunity to have maybe a review or a repeat where something wasn't clear, how many ways that it can be impacted for a student. So it looks like a simple, when we talk about the 4-part processor, it looks rather simple. It's nice to have it in 4 parts to be able to view it, but it also should be a strong reminder about the many ways in which when we teach, we need to be aware where our students are with it and the areas that they might need support with. Likewise, areas that maybe they have strengths with, and how we can take those strengths and help them round out a student's experience with reading and spelling and text. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the 4-part processor and the research that has gone into that, mostly because it's, as an educator, this is why we can reach 95% of our students. This is the rationale behind knowing how to address them. It's what's happening in the brain. I wish the processor were an appliance like on my kitchen counter that you could just plug in and it will do the thing. But we actually have to build this and assess it and make sure that our students have these processes informed and become accurate and automatic. So yeah, it's a really good thing to attend to as we're having this conversation today. Let's get to the how-to. This is a routine for teaching any new word. It is not my own. It is Anita Archer's. And if any of you have ever seen her, that woman is very dynamic. And she has a pace that is like none other. I love it. I love to watch her teach. So this, for me, was initially like mapping phonemes to graphemes can be a little bit arduous in the beginning. So it's got 4 steps. Fantastic. But I'm going to take us through this with a word that I actually got, word of the day from dictionary.com a few weeks ago that took me by surprise. So we're going to learn a new word. But this is the routine. You pronounce the word, you write it, you read it. And automatically, I hope you're thinking about that 4-part processor. Going back to that, we say it. We focus on the phonemes, the syllables. We're talking about the phonemic structure of that word. We write it. So there we have engaged the orthographic processor. And then also the next thing, we tell the student what the new word means. So now we've engaged the meaning part of that processor. We use a student-friendly definition to do that. And of course, visual and experiential supports, especially important if you're teaching English language learners. And then we say more about the word, more exposures to that word, right? We say it several times while giving examples of its use and saying what it is not. Non-examples are just as important too. And then asking questions about the word's meaning, just to help transfer that information from your brain to the student's brain, right? That gradual release of responsibility. So we want to build that in our students. And then we ask them, it's that to, with, and by, right? Then we ask them to use the word. And then they can own it, right? So let's do this. We're going to start with something called Dell's scale. I love it because it's super easy to remember that because Dell and scale rhyme. But Edgar Dell was a researcher clear back in 1965. He was focusing on levels of word knowledge. So I'm going to ask you to take a quick assessment. Don't worry, you don't need to study for this. This is the word. If any of you subscribe to dictionary.com and they have a word of the day, this was the word of the day a few weeks ago. It's tohu bohu. So I want you to take a look at that word. I've just pronounced it, and I want you to think about your level of knowledge of that word. Level 1, which you could represent with one finger. You can put it in the chat if you want to, if you've never seen or heard that word before. Level 2, you've seen it or heard it, but you don't know what it means. Level 3, I vaguely know the meaning of the word. I can associate it with a concept or a context. Or level 4, I know the word well, can explain it and use it in speaking and listening. Okay, so just really quickly,
Stacy, I have to point out, they're all ones. Thank you very much.
I know. This is a beautiful word to demonstrate. I think dictionary.com. No, Maria, don't Google.
Don't Google specifically.
Don't Google just yet. We're going to learn it. But when I'm using this with my students, and even terms like orthographic processor, when I'm teaching my college students, I will say, hold up 1, 2, 3, or 4 fingers, and they become more familiar with what that means, right? So we're all at ones. I was at a 1 when I saw this word as well. So let's take ourselves through this process with the word. Okay, tohu bohu. First, we're going to analyze it on the syllable level. Tohu bohu. We have 4 syllables in that word. Lots of phonemes when we're breaking down those syllables, but we have some repeating phonemes, right? To, so we have to, oo, ba, o, oo. Tohu bohu. And if you were in a classroom with me, I would have you say those sounds with me, right? O, oo, ba, o, hu. Tohu bohu. So orthographically, it's spelled very close to how it sounds. The only difference is to represent the oo sound, we're going to use a U in this case. We know it can be represented in different ways. But other than that, the spelling is Tohu bohu. That's a lot of letters. And we've taken the time now to pronounce it, write it, and read it. I would write it. I would have you write it maybe a couple times. It does sound like gibberish. I agree. Okay, let's go to step 2. Now we're going to define the word. Tohu bohu is actually a noun, and it means chaos, confusion, and disorder. Okay, now I'm starting to relate to this word a little bit. So morphologically, it's not an English word, but it does have morphemes. Tohu means formless or confusion, and bohu means emptiness. So it's similar to a compound word, but it does have 2 morphemes. So it means formless, confusion, emptiness. The history of the word is fascinating to me because it's a Hebrew word and it means without form and void. So you can imagine chaos as a result, right? I put some illustrations down here to help me remember that that's what it means. It's just chaos, disorganization, confusion. And these pictures kind of represent that for me, whether it's physical, in my physical world, or in my brain, which can happen a lot as well. Okay, the next step then is to say more about the word. So, for example, putting together a puzzle is an example of going from tohu bohu to order. Do you remember when you open a puzzle and you see all those pieces? I have a friend who can put a puzzle together. She can take it from tohu bohu to order a lot faster than I can. But that's one example. This is how I would use it in a sentence. I feel really calm when my room is not tohu bohu. So here's a before and after picture of tohu bohu and one that's more orderly, right? We're going to I'll ask you questions about the word. I would do this with my students. Which class is demonstrating tohu bohu? Well, clearly the one on my left, right? The students are all throwing things out of their desks. And then the other class is not demonstrating tohu bohu because look how orderly and they're all reading, with the exception of, our student who's very familiar with the camera in the room. But that's okay because she's smiling. Okay, so that's a question I could ask you about the word. So I'm going to ask you questions now. I want you to think about this. Wherever you're sitting right now, is it tohu bohu? Is your desk tohu bohu? Can you tolerate tohu bohu? I know as teachers, there are different levels of toleration for that, right? Was your first day of teaching tohu bohu? Or was it calm and peaceful and relaxing? If it was, I'd like to hear about it. Did you experience tohu bohu teaching online during COVID? I know we all probably had a moment of that, right? Or when a student forgets to turn off their microphone and you can hear the tohu bohu that is in their house. Is this process becoming a little less tohu bohu for you? I hope so. Now it is your turn to use tohu bohu in a sentence. If you're feeling really brave, like Marianne, please put one in the chat and we will be reading it. Marianne said, my desk looks like tohu bohu, but not to me. So other people might think it's tohu bohu, right? Yes, Lindsay, I can relate to that. Yesterday, starting getting my class ready, it was tohu bohu, sorry. But then I can clean up and it looks fine. My room right now is tohu bohu as I try to prepare for the new year. Yes. COVID brain is tohu bohu. I think you guys have got it. Moving created much tohu bohu at our house. Oh, Karen, I can relate. I moved about a year ago, actually, and I'm still unpacking. I still have rooms that are tohu bohu because of the move. Oh, Louisa, tohu bohu day. I'm so sorry. Our contemporary world is full of tohu bohu. Yes. Okay. You guys have got it. I am really confident in your knowledge of that word. So let's just take a post test really fast. Back to Dell's handy skill. Now I would like you to put in the chat your level of knowledge of this word. Is it level 1? Have you never seen or heard the word before? Is it 2? Look at all these 4s, and it even will be okay if there's a few 3s, right? But in a very short amount of time, we have very quickly taught that word. So you can see that in a classroom, you can do this as well. And again, we're hitting all of those areas of instruction, all the parts of the brain that needs to be informed as we're going forward with vocabulary instruction. Now we have to take a special focus, of course, on words like this when we're talking about students who are learning English as an additional language. And so our next slide, Donell will give us a cross-linguistic example.
Yeah, so this was a great presentation. Stacy, you and I have had a conversation. This is Cardoza, that's Dr. Cardoza that we've talked about. So cross-linguistic example, if you have students that you know of that are English language learners, this might be small group, even as a whole class, you can have this activity. You might choose a word that you could take this class through, and the word would be in English, canoe. We're going to say the word, and the word in Spanish is very similar. So it's nice to choose something that is similar so that students can already think about what they think, oh, I think that word might be. So the word in Spanish is canoa. And then you're going to say how many syllables are in the Spanish word and how many are in the English words. You're looking for similarities between those two. How many sounds in Spanish? How many sounds in English? And then how many morphemes or meaning units? Notice how we started with the sounds, just like Stacy did earlier as well, taking us through that, kind of familiarizing with the word. How many morphemes or meaning units? There's 1. Let's discuss the meaning of the word canoe. Let's describe and then compare and contrast it with a ship. So like Stacy has done with what it is and is not. Is the word a noun? So what part of speech? Can it ever be used as a verb? And talk about what that might look like if it's ever used as a verb. Can you use the word in a sentence? And so taking, just like Stacy did for the word in English, we could do this with cross-linguistic. And can you describe the similarities and differences in the spelling of canoe in English and Spanish? And so this is a nice way of not only being able to help a student who is learning English, but imagine having this activity even for a whole group of students in your class who would then really have a command of the English word and additionally have some understanding of a Spanish word. So it could be used as a fun activity for that as well.
Yeah, very powerful. And thinking about all the connections that could be made in a brain in a non-tohu bohu manner, right? In a non-chaotic way. Sorry, I can't get enough of the word.
No,
so as we're talking about how to make our instruction that much more powerful. And again, we're not teaching this in isolation. It is impacting other areas of literacy. So we're getting the biggest bang for our buck. So let's talk about how this might look in other content areas besides literacy instruction. So let's look at math. That's on our next slide here. Let's talk about a word that we introduce as early as kindergarten or first grade. It's in the first grade core. And well, it might be in the kindergarten too. But let's talk about the word subtract. So rather than just getting up in front of your class and teaching them how to subtract, let's talk about this word. It's a verb. Students, this is something we are going to do. We are going to subtract. Subtract means to take away from. Let's listen to that word and tell me how many syllables are in it. Subtract. How many do you hear? 2. Right. And let's take the first syllable, sub. How many sounds in that syllable? B. Exactly. Tract, t, act. And again, we're building phonemic awareness at this point, phonological and phonemic awareness already. We're not even 2 seconds into the word, right? Now we're going to talk about the spelling of this word. So what sounds would you expect to hear in the first syllable? We heard the sound sub, sorry. What letters would you expect represent those sounds? S is S. Usually represented by U. B, we know that's a B. Again, you can emphasize letter formation. You're writing this on the board as your students are watching. It gives us an opportunity to focus on, in the second syllable, our phonics instruction. Maybe we've taught blends already. Oh, do you hear a blend? Tract. Now, I'll tell you, my first graders, if they were to write this word without this kind of a focus, 9 times out of 10 at the beginning of the year, they would put a CH where that TR is. It would be subtract, right? So we can focus on pronunciation, placement, subtract. The letter C is representing the K sound. Again, we're building phonics knowledge and word recognition and having a reciprocal impact on phonemic awareness as well, all in one interaction. And then I'm going to talk about what this word means. So sub just kind of means under or beneath, but tract means to drag or to pull. So how many of you have seen a tractor, right? We'd say that. A tractor drags, pulls. That's what we do. If we're detracting for something, we're pulling, we're taking away that pull from something. So if we're subtracting, we are taking away from. We're dragging or pulling something away from something else. So I would use that in a sentence. There were 12 eggs in the carton, but I subtracted 2. I could say that sentence like this too. There were 12 eggs in that carton, but I took 2 out. I took them away. So that's a really important thing to do, to use it in context as soon as you focus on the word. So that is one example for math. This is another way that we could just bring that learning into our literacy instruction as well, and just really emphasize those concepts for math and for reading. So writing the word, having the students take the time to spell it, that, by the way, is the most efficient way to get that word into a student's long-term memory. And we focus on the meaning of it so they can draw a picture of what that represents to them. I will be totally transparent. When I first started doing this kind of an activity with my first graders, that draw a picture part appealed to me because they like to draw. And I thought, good, then they'll be engaged in this activity. They can draw a picture. But that was really telling for me. The picture that they drew to represent the word was one of the best forms of assessment for how well they understood the word. So it's not just a time filler, right? And then I have them write a sentence when it's appropriate. And then when we talked about going over non-examples too, they can be just as powerful. So an antonym would be to add, right? We're putting something into, not pulling it or dragging it away from. So that's one example in math. We have the word angle as well. And think about the word angle. You can analyze it on all of these levels. So on the same way, we won't take the time to go through it, but an angle is a space between 2 intersecting lines. We talk about the syllables, the phonemes. Now here is an important distinction. How many of you have taught first graders or second graders that spell angle, angel, or angel, angle, right? Because they're kind of using but confusing those sounds. So when you have the opportunity to focus on the spelling of the word angle, that is your opportunity to point out that it has the GL blend, it ends with an LE, and it's not GEL, because if we spelled it GEL, it would actually sound like angel, which is a different word, right? So again, you have all these opportunities. We're talking about a time of day that we're focusing on math, but you're also building literacy, content area instruction at the same time. And then the history of the word, I think, is the home run for this, because the history of it is related to, it's a word, a Latin word that means an angle, related to a word that means a corner. Now, as a first grader, I can wrap my head around that, right? So going to the next slide, now that we have an understanding of the word angle, and we have some pictures demonstrating that in math and in their environment, it's not so hard to teach what a triangle is, right? So tri means 3. Angle, we already know, is a corner. Triangle has how many corners? 3. Rect means straight. So it's a straight angle. A rectangle has 4 straight angles, 4 corners. That's a little longer than a square, right? And then we have the antonym would be a circle, because there are no lines, no straight lines, no corners. And something else that will really help them is to point out that it is not angel. It is not spelled angel. That would be a different thing. And so these are ways that we can really bring those words not only to life for understanding whatever task we're asking in the present moment, but also in their long-term memory, right? So we don't often take that example to highlight the phonemic structure of words that we're teaching in math or the spelling, the orthographic structure. Now, as a teacher, of course, you would do this with an approach that is closely tied to what you know they know as far as phonics instruction goes. So in some cases, you might have to teach them that part of the word they're just going to have to know by heart for now. But when we learn it later in phonics, you'll know the spelling will be explained. Making those decisions, the art and science of teaching, right? Okay, so speaking of science, let's look at science. And I won't belabor, a lot of these are kind of repeats of the same process, but wanted to use enough repetition to help you get the concept solidly. So teaching a word like matter, we would take it through the same steps, right? None of this is going to be surprising to you. When we get to the graphemes, I could really focus on those double consonants depending on what I've taught. This matter is a big focus of second grade science content. So at that point, that's a good time to teach double consonants, and also, focusing on those R-controlled vowels. Again, this is science, but we're emphasizing it. Now, etymologically, this is really cool because the meaning of matter is literally the stuff that things are made of. It takes up space, right? That's what the scientific, the standard would want us to take away from that. But here is the cool thing etymologically. It's related to a Latin word that means mother, right? So it's something from which something is made. So that also helps students really own that word. So all matter takes up space. Solids and liquids are types of matter. Matter also causes a little bit of a hiccup when we're talking about it generally, has multiple meanings. But we're going to address that because you think back to the 4-part processor, that meaning processor, its job is to automatically come up with all the possible meanings for that word. And you've got to build that part of the processor. Now, the context processor will help us weed that out in the brain and know which one that the text is referring to. But these are other meanings for that. So you'd want to use them in context, focus on the part of speech, because frequently that's different. In this case, they're all nouns, but they're also words that they might hear when somebody asks you, what's the matter, right? You don't mean what's taking up space. Well, kind of, you do, right? What's taking up space in your heart or your head, and talking about all those connections. We always want to address those multiple meanings, and then put them into context right away. So what kind of matter are these sentences referring to? The universe is made of different types of matter, stuff that things are made of, right? Temperature has an effect on the state of the matter of ice. It can be a liquid, it can be a solid. So always using context and to help kind of merge those together, but file them in a way that's not tohu bohu or confusing in the brain, right? Okay, next slide will help us really carry that message home when we're talking about science specifically. I want to take a minute to note that this comes from a website called ReadWorks. I recommend it. It's free for teachers. All kinds of text for science and math, or all grade levels. But this is where this passage comes from. So as we have taught that word, and maybe we'll choose 2 or 3 more in this passage as we're asking our students to read it. We should never assign a passage to read without preparing it like this. So as students are reading through this, we can learn specifically in that 3rd paragraph, solids and liquids have something in common. They are both states of matter. Matter is everywhere. It is anything that takes up space and has mass. Mass is probably another word we want to teach, right? Mass is a measure of how much matter is in an object. All objects are made of matter. I wanted to highlight that paragraph for a really important reason. We've already taught the word matter. So cognitively, their load is not that heavy. So when they get to a word like mass, even if we haven't taught it, they're more likely to learn that word. because they're not focusing on the word matter that was in the previous sentences, and they're related, right? So they're building that lexicon. And again, going back to Profetti's research, this is why we want to focus on the meaning of words, why we want to focus on vocabulary, has an impact on all things literacy. Donell, I feel like I've said a lot of syllables. Anything you want to add to that?
They're all good syllables.
Thank you.
No, just the power, again, Stacy, emphasizing the power of a teacher and educator who understands how to take the explanation of a word, starting with the sounds, moving through, taking it apart of its syllable types, and then moving to the meaning of a word, and how you can take that into any subject. It's so powerful. And things that it is, things that it's not, and those conversations that then become so very comfortable for a student to have about the words that they're seeing and encountering, the power of that in the classroom is just, you can't replace it.
Yeah. And do you know what? I've seen newer teachers, especially because their brain space is, those of us who remember that first day of teaching and looking at that empty plan book and thinking, what am I going to fill this with? And then very quickly, like, I don't have enough time. So we end up thinking reading is taught from 9 to 11, and I'm going to focus on reading then. Then I have math in the afternoon. Then I have science Tuesdays and Thursdays. But reading, clearly, very important part, but we can't forget to make those connections to other content areas. And Donell, you're going to talk about how we can take the concepts that we've talked about on the word level and vocabulary level into our reading instruction as well.
Yeah, you bet. So we've done a lot of this already, but just this is one example. I thought this was a really good one. Again, I've picked up for reading practice and language for EL students, but it works in any context. And we have this graph here. You could use whatever it is you're explaining or we want to focus on. Here, it's going to be J, so the letter and the sound, J. And what we've done here is down the side, you can see on the 4, the phonology, vocabulary, grammar, pragmatics. Those are the things that we want to concentrate on. And we've made this word chart that has all of those words that begin with that sound, that particular sound and letter that we're thinking about. And then underneath at the bottom, you can see there are 3 sentences chosen intentionally from the words in the chart that we're going to discuss, the phonology of them, the vocabulary of those words, some of the grammar. So then we get to place those words inside of a sentence and talk about the grammar of the word. And then the pragmatics would be in reading the sentence and being able to see all those words together in a sentence and what the meaning is then and how you might say the sentence. So that's even an activity that you can do. So just this chart here, you can see all of the things that you can teach and the activities that you can have just from one chart that's going to take students through so many different parts of words. And again, we could talk about why some are uppercase, why some are lowercase, and that's just sitting right there in the chart. And I don't think we do this enough in just taking a few words and working with those that have a similarity that can really teach concepts to students and be very, very powerful. And they remember them as they move forward. And then the activity could be taking turns reading the sentence. Then you can go for meaning, what that might mean. That sentence, Jen went on a jet. We could talk about what's the context that we might need. What jet? Why is she going on a jet? So just all of the ways that you can start with the words and move to meaning. So this next one, let's conclude with a new word. Stacy, you're going to take us through elucidate.
Elucidate. And you know what? Let's do a quick Dell scale. 1, 2, 3, 4. How familiar are you with the elucidate? Never heard the word before as a 1. The 2 is, I think so, maybe with context. 3, yes, I'm pretty sure I got it, but not 100%. 4, totally own this word. I know it. So yeah, like you, lots of 1s and 2s. We have some 3s and 4s. But I hope you're also looking at this word from a morpheme level, on the morpheme level too, right? Loose, and spelled this way, always has to do with light. So our word is elucidate. 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 4 syllables. We could talk a lot about the phonetic structure of that word. The C representing the sound because it's followed by an I. We have a long A in that last syllable because that's silent E on the end. We could analyze every syllable of it, we could take the time to do that if we had it. So the meaning of this word is to make lucid or clear, right? To shed light on something. That's actually what it means. It's a French and Latin influences actually related to light. To throw light upon is a word that it's related to. So if I am elucidating, I would say, well, if I'm focusing on using it in context, graphs in math help elucidate the data for me. When I look at a graph, it throws light upon what's happening with the data. I was still confused about the order of operations, so I asked the teacher to elucidate further. Throw some more light on that for me, will you? Because it's not clear for me. And then I could ask you questions. If you are elucidating something for your students, are you building their knowledge or causing tohu bohu? You guys were speaking a whole different language by the end of this webinar.
I knew you were going to do that.
Yeah. Well, now I totally own that word. Is there a 5? Is there a 5 on Dell's scale? Because I feel like I'm approaching 5. So I would ask a whole lot of yes and no words about the word elucidate, right? If you were required to take a test about physics, would you need someone to elucidate some concepts? Or do you feel crystal clear about it already? And so if you can think of a way to use that in a sentence, feel free to put it in the chat. I know we're kind of running low on time. So I want to bring it home by asking, did we elucidate for you
There it is.
how to teach students to remember words for reading, spelling, and meaning? Did we throw some light on that for you? Did we elucidate for you the importance of teaching multiple dimensions of a word? Why would we take the time to do that in science and math instruction, right? Hopefully, did we elucidate for you how to apply word knowledge to that content instruction? And so that was our hope, right? So we'll go back to where we started. Hopefully your sky is clearer. We have elucidated for you vocabulary, word learning in different content areas. And now it's your turn to elucidate vocabulary for your students. So grateful that you're doing that. Thank you for the work that you do for our students. It is our greatest passion to teach reading well. This is our vote of confidence for you. You have got this. It's the beginning of a year. Things might seem tohu bohu, but I think very shortly you're going to see those light bulbs go off in your students' brains as you elucidate all things literacy for them and other content areas. So thank you for joining us today. Donell, parting words.
Gosh, Stacy, this was nice. I've been seeing in the chat teachers talking about these are things that that you've at one point or another in your career and you do them, but it's nice to have at the beginning of a year a nice reminder about how important they are and to start off the year remembering to do them, right?
Yeah, that's so powerful. And, I like to tell my students this, and this is also not new to most of us on this webinar, that teaching is an art and a science. And the art actually is translating that science to application, right, in the classroom. And I think these are the things. I will attend something like this and get super excited, then go back to my classroom and kind of forget it until somebody elucidates it for me again. Throw some more light on it. Remember this? Yeah, let's do that. As Donell and I were preparing for this, we knew we were not preparing anything revelatory or new. But these reminders are really important for our profession. And again, thank you for all that you do for our students. Thank you for being here today.
All right, I think we might have a few minutes for some questions, Stacy and Donell. So how do you feel about trying to answer a couple of these?
Yeah, if we have some questions, great.
Yeah. And if we don't get to your question on air here, we'll be sending out an email afterwards, and we will go through those and we will prepare some answers for you, and you'll get those via email. So thank you for a fabulous presentation. It definitely was not tohu bohu at all. And many people here put that right in the chat that this was not tohu bohu.
Because we're all on our way to level 5 with that word. Good job.
Okay, so let's start with a question Are there some back to school activities that we can introduce to students that will establish early word study routines for both literacy and across the curriculum?
Do you know, my quick answer to that would be absolutely Googling Anita Archer, watching her teach that word learning strategy that we just went through with Tohu Bohu and Elucidate, and seeing how proficient she is at that. I am still working on emulating it on that level, but that is a very good strategy to use no matter what part of the day that you're instructing for your students. I think just having it front of mind will be really helpful as well. And then another activity I think is really important, depending on what you're teaching, is to have students gather words, be word collectors, right?
I was going to say that one.
Words that are related. Yeah. And just
Yeah.
have them bring words to you that think might be related to the concept you're covering. Donell, what else?
That's so, Stacy, that was the one that I was thinking of that I try to do even tutoring. The tutoring setting is to have students bring always from the get-go words that they encounter that maybe were confusing, didn't understand, would like to take apart. And we even keep them in a word bank. And then as we get to skills that take them apart, and sometimes I say, is this a word we can put in the bank? Is this a word that we need to take apart today for you? And if they say, no, it can go in the bank, we have some we keep in the bank. And then when we get to the skill, we pull them out and start working with them. And so the words are always there, and you have them engaging with words on a level that feels comfortable to them. You can do that classroom. I've done it classroom. You could do it as a tutoring, with a tutoring setting with a student. And the other one is I've done it even teaching life skills classes. I had a life skills class. We had a word wall. So you can do this in any setting, which I think is great.
Yeah, have those vocabulary. You know what, Lynn, you absolutely, I was going to mention that book, The Word Collector. It is a great way to open. Yeah. And to build that. Yeah.
I like that term.
Thank you, Charity.
Let's just try one more question. I know we're running out of time, but we do have a question about scaffolds. What would be the best scaffolds to use with reading students?
Depending on the content area or where the student is, there could be a lot of different scaffolds. If we're talking about phonemic awareness, we frequently talk about the scaffold of using hand motions when you're focusing on different sounds of the alphabet or whatever. You want those hand motions eventually, you want to make sure students aren't relying on them. Adding the scaffolds of letters when you're talking about those phonemes. If a student has that alphabetical knowledge, that one-to-one correspondence down idea, it kind of depends on where the student is. One important scaffold that I think Donell mentioned in this webinar was for those students who can't access text on the level that you'd like them to, no matter their grade level. But having an audio version of that is very important, so they're not missing the content. You could also have other students who are more proficient at reading record that content. So they're getting practice. The student who needs to hear it can get it too. A lot of it depends on this context and the student, but there are a lot of scaffolds.
Yeah, I was going to just, Stacy, support you with that one too. And my son who has dyslexia, we scaffold the whole way and supported at whatever level he was at to make sure that he could always engage with text in a meaningful way, and would always do a lot of setup to give him background, to enjoy a piece of text or something. And I have to say that as he got older, his enjoyment of literature, even when he was struggling at different points, he never lost his enjoyment of literature, which is the whole point.
And if I could just add, I know we're wrapping up, but the really critical thing about scaffolds is that they go away.
Yeah.
Right. I've done it in my own teaching where I don't attend to that, and a student ends up, I used to have a word wall, and my students would rely on that. They weren't getting it in their brain. They were looking at the wall to know how to spell the words. So that's a scaffold that probably should be taken away eventually. So thank you for that question.
That's a great point. All right. I think we are going to wrap it up because we are out of time. So on behalf of Reading Horizons, we just want to thank you for joining us today. Remember, if you're interested in finding more about our science-based phonics curriculum and online software and professional learning that we offer, you can go to readinghorizons.com, or you can call 800-333-0054. All right, so Just really want to thank everybody again for attending. Thanks for staying on a little bit longer, and just look for your follow-up emails from EdWeb and from Reading Horizons. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.